Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here. It's my first time in Bratislava. I'm from Stockholm, Sweden. My name is, as you heard, Tommy Palm. I'm serial entrepreneur. I've started 5 companies. Resolution is my 5th in the video games industry. The main reason I'm here is that I invested in some fantastic tech, voxel engine that we'll speak more about today, but I also want to take the opportunity to share some random thoughts that I have about visual computing and video games in general. I've been working with video games for the past 20 years professionally, and I started back in the Commodore 64 days on a hobby basis back in the 80s. So that's a young kid. So I would like to start here. As an engineer, always been very fascinated with human development. And if you look at information technology, it kind of started here. We don't know for sure. Some 100 to 50,000 years ago, people, humans started to talk to each other. This is what the scientists are saying. We don't have any written proof, obviously, because writing didn't occur until the next here, some 5,000 years ago. It's a huge leap when you can write experiences down, recipes, etc., that you can share with generations after you. Then it took another couple of thousand years until the printing press came in 1456, the Gutenberg printing press, which made it easy to mass print books much quicker, so more than only the elite would have the ability to get access to books. Then some 50 years ago or so, the internet came about and started making information much more widely accessible. About 10 years ago, I would argue, the smartphones came and put that information so we could always access it with the tip of our fingers. And right about now, there is a big paradigm shift in computing with virtual reality and augmented reality that I like to refer to as visual computing. There's many different terms. Some people use mixed reality, MR, but Microsoft kind of took that term, so fewer and fewer people are using it. XR is another thing that means basically the same thing. This is coming at the same time as we're also having a big paradigm shift in AI, and AI is actually becoming usable. AI has been around for a long time, but it's coming to change our life quicker and quicker. And one of the interesting things here that you see very clearly in this graph is that these changes are happening faster and faster, and they have bigger and bigger impact on our ability to learn information. One great way of visualizing it, I think, is to look at education as one thing. This is an old book on medicine to learn about surgery. And here is Surgeon Simulator, which is not at all a medical educational tool. It's a game, it's fun. But it's very easy to understand that if you are in virtual reality and experience something, it's way much easier for your brain to remember that. You feel that you experience it, so much rather when you're in that real situation, you have much easier to access that information than you have if you read it. The visual computing is hard because it's not really there yet. It's on the verge of happening. This is Magic Leap 1 that is just about to launch. It will be the first commercial AR headset, most likely. There is already today Microsoft's initiatives, but it's for bigger companies and very limited technology. This is the first real serious step into AR glasses. Eventually, a lot of people think that this type of technology will replace your smartphone, that you will no longer walk around with a screen in your pocket because you don't need it. You have something very lightweight like regular set classes that can help you project information when you need to see it. And also one very important thing, it has a camera that is, or several cameras most likely, that helps your computer to help interpret the world around you. And one great way of looking at it is to see it as a link between the virtual world and the real world. And it will help software to become context aware. So it knows where you are and what you want to do. And already now you can see this with your smartphone. Your smartphone is getting much smarter. If you come to a place and you open your iPhone or your Android, it can predict what type of app you want to open. And that's extremely useful and saves a lot of time. If it knows that you're going to use your Uber app, or it knows it's going to use your bank app based on what time of day it is, where you are, etc. There is a really cool technology coming from Google Lens that you can have access to through Google Photos already now. That's something that is a very early and experimental phase that Google is working on, where it looks at photos and it recognizes objects in those photos. So you can take one of your pictures, and if it recognizes a landmark, it will directly give you a link to Wikipedia about information about that landmark, for instance. If it's a business card, it can immediately take that information and put it into your contacts. And this is something as a developer you can access Lens technology. So you don't need to make object recognition from photo. Is one of the most complex things that you can do, but you don't have to do that yourself. You only need to call APIs on the cloud in order to get to it. We are seeing more and more virtual assistants pop up. A lot of people remember Clippy from the early days of Microsoft, this that helped you write letters in Word. It was not a very great example of a virtual assistant, but they are getting way much smarter, and they save you a lot of time, which I think is very important. One thing that's very popular today is differentiating between true statements and false statements. That's something that I think a lot of people need. I think a lot of us has a friend on social media or a relative that is posting things that every time we see it, we go like, oh. You have to be that nerdy guy who says, well, if you look it up on snoops.com, you'll find that that's actually not true. It can also help with simple things like remember where you left know where you have your things. I'm one of those person who constantly leave things behind. That would be very helpful to me. One of the things that virtual reality is very good at, something called presence, and that is, the sense that you feel that you have gone somewhere else, that you teleported to another place. And that's extremely powerful when it comes to social interactions with other people. In games where you have characters, you feel much more emotionally attached to those characters than you do if you look at the 2D screen and you see a Hollywood movie. If you have those characters in 3D, your brain does something to you, so it's much more efficient. So therefore, it looks like it's going to be much better to do meetings in virtual reality and AR than it is today with video conferencing, etc. It can also help with simple things like prioritizing or getting you to focus on something if you want to learn something or if you want to work with something. And creativity is another area where VR and AR is amazing at. There will be entire worlds that need to be populated, and this is a great place to create those things. I'll go into that a little bit more later. You can kind of think of AR as an exoskeleton of the mind, something that makes you stronger and then powers you to do things more efficiently. I think that's a very, very powerful thing. Obviously, if you can enhance humans, the development will just go faster and faster. One person who inspired me a lot is Steve Jobs. And he has this great quote when he says, "Life can be much broader once you discover one simple fact. Everything around you that you call life was made up by people who are no smarter than you. You can change it, you can influence it, you can build your own things that other people can use. Once you learn that, you'll never be the same." He and Apple made the iPhone, which I'm very happy for. That's where I made my fortune. I started with mobile games very early, and it took a really long time. It wasn't until the iPhone came along when it was actually economically viable to make games for smartphones. So if this is this groundbreaking new technology, why am I talking about games? Why I'm so passionate about games? A lot of people, and especially if you go to investors, they will feel that games is a waste of money, it's for kids. Now, a lot of people tell me, well, my kids or my grandkids play a game. You know, that'll be fun for them to meet you. But the cool thing with visual computing is that the actual building blocks of making apps or experience or software will be game technology. Building 3D assets, making characters, building worlds, level design, putting everything together, sound, animations. I started with it because I loved games. It's simple as that. I love playing games. It's fun. But it's starting to be much more important than that. This is a game. This is a picture I really like. It's from one of the games I made a long time ago. And this is the actual team behind it. So I'm up here to the left, and the guy who drew it, Henrik Pettersson, is there with his baseball bat. And it's a depiction of the French resistance movement, a small group during the World War where the game was set. But I really like this analogy because it's the way I feel the best teamwork gets made. Small teams that are experts in different fields, that are have the same goal, and we set up the company that I work for now this way. So we have small teams, up to 8 people. They can sit close to each other and talk directly to one another. There's no manager there where they have to ask if they can do a certain thing. This is a very Scandinavian way to work, I think, and a part of the reason why Scandinavia has been so successful in creating great software applications. So as long as your software fits within this rather small team structure, it's a very, very efficient way to work at it if you are good at communicating. Communicating is one of the most difficult things. Obviously, you lose a lot of effect. That's why you many times see just a single person making fantastic game experience. I'll mention Minecraft later down the line. It's both a great example and not a typical example. Obviously, very, very few people sit at home, create a game, sells it to Microsoft for several billions of dollars. It's not something that happens every day, but it does happen, which is really cool. I'm not smart enough to create my own game and become that rich, so I need to work in a team. So this is something I put together where I try to make sense of the difference between augmented reality and virtual reality, because in many ways they are very different technologies. And please stop me and ask questions if you feel you need. There is no stupid questions. I've been nerding down in this far too long to be a good, to know if I'm on a good level or not. So AR is augmented reality in English. I think you mentioned the word in Slovak, but my Slovak is very limited, so I don't know the word. I think that augmented reality is a much bigger opportunity. So these are actually a Venn diagram with 2 very big circles. This circle is bigger than the other circle, but it's not very easy to see. So one thing that is very different right now, at least, is the use case. So if you play VR, you're typically at home and you can't walk around. You need to be rather still. You can have a dedicated space where you can play your VR game if you have room scale VR. Whereas with AR, you're meant to walk around and interact with other people, so you see through these goggles. But a lot of the things are very, very similar. You have navigation, social components being very, very strong within this field. If you are doing something in AR and you're the only person who have AR on you, you feel a little bit like you are hearing voices in your head because nobody else can see what you're seeing. But if you see the same thing, it's very satisfying to work on something collaboratively. The devices are slightly different right now, but there is a lot of reason to think that they will use absolutely the same components. At least they're already doing that, especially the camera component that's used for AR is also now coming in the VR headsets. And they are monitoring how the walls and the depth are around you. It's very good for focus. When you're in a virtual world, you want to be just there. When somebody else is talking to you, it's very difficult to keep a conversation both in the virtual world and in the real world. That's very different from the AR situation than it is from the VR situation. In AR, right now we're talking about mobile AR and head-mounted AR, which is two different things, but mobile AR is leading towards head-mounted AR quite a lot. So a lot of the same technology can be used both. And if you're very interested in AR, this is a place where you can start. But there's a lot of things that you can already do today. Controls are similar in many aspects. You want to use the hands as much as possible to be able to have very precise tracking of fingers and hands, which is something that is a really, really complex problem. Hardware are similar. Voice is going to be important. User interface have very similar problems in both these cases, and it's rather complex. There's many situations where when you're working with it, you realize that this is something that you didn't think about. Sometimes you have private information that you don't want the other people to see if you're in a shared environment, and whereas most of the times you want the world to look exactly the same so you can truly have a shared experience and don't have network things that are out of sync because your conversation inside the virtual world becomes very weird and tricky. Both of these technologies work really well with kind of mind tricks. We're trying to trick your brain. That's what a lot of it is about. So realistic lighting and shadows and things are things that really works really well. And AI is another important area for software in general that is happening at a similar time. I started studying computer science seriously at something called Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm back in the mid-90s. One of my best friends came up to me and he showed me his new Nokia 6110 and it had multiplayer snakes on it, and it blew my mind. Everybody's going to walk around with a Game Boy capable device in their pocket. So I went out to my parents. I said, I'm quitting school. I need to start a games company immediately. It's going to be huge. And they were a bit skeptical, and they were right to be so because it took a long time. I basically started here somewhere when it was possible to develop for the phones. It wasn't possible to distribute games yet in a proper fashion. And it wasn't until here, somewhere 2009 actually, when there was possible to make any decent money on games on phones. But I learned a lot working during this time, and I created a really powerful network of people, and I received a lot of awards, and I was a struggling artist, which also can be enjoyable. Eventually, I sold my kind of third startup in the games industry to King. This is a picture from Taiwanese television where they're interviewing me about Candy Crush Saga that I was a part of making. So my company that I sold to King, we made a game engine, and the first game we made there was the mobile version of Candy Crush at the same time as the Facebook version was being developed. So that was a fantastic journey to be on. I was there for 3 years until 2015 when I left and started this company, Resolution Games, that is focused on visual computing. I bring with me, from working with mobile games, I bring a lot of lessons with me. Some of it is how much there is in accessibility. If you make games much easier for people to understand and download, I think free-to-play has been fantastic on opening up the target audience on who would play games. My sister and my mother now plays video games. They always played my games during me growing up and making games, but it was always like, oh, that's cute. But with Candy Crush, they were properly hooked and calling me, asking for me to send them lives and things. A part of this is just social. Making single-player games is much easier from a programmer point of view. But once the game becomes social, they become 10 times as fun, and it becomes much more meaningful to play a great game with somebody else. There's a lot of things to say on all these topics. Games as a service is something that I still am amazed about how few that really embrace this part here, that you need to work with the game continuously, looking at data and the shift that happened from the box development to digital development is a lot about understanding your users much better and being good at understanding what happens when a game goes live, which is incredibly difficult. It's one thing to stand behind somebody who's playing something and see, oh yeah, of course they didn't get that, and you go back and fix it. But when you send something out live to 200 countries in the world, it is impossible almost. Even if you did your homework and programmed collecting data, it's very, very difficult to understand what's going on. So it can't be stressed enough. When it comes to virtual reality and partially augmented reality, it's about tricking the 5 senses, right? So it's visual systems, taste, smell, hearing, and touch. And on these 3, we have come quite along. There is research being done and smell and taste as well, but it's not going very well, and then not being super, super important for the things that we want to do in games. When it comes to smell, it turns out that the molecules that produce a smell, they tend to clump together and get stuck on things and turn this really nasty smells after a while. So they're working on it. But as a developer, this is something that's very good to think about when it comes to making VR games. You need to trick the brain that it's somewhere else. But one of the things that we found out rather early is that it's much more convincing to do dark scenes than doing light scenes. As a game designer, kind of naturally think it would be amazing to be out on a hill and look down over an open landscape. And it is, but it's just extremely difficult to do that convincing. It's much easier for the brain to accept that it's in a damp cellar and there is monsters coming out of the walls. That's something that you instantly will believe, and you want to get out of there. But it's not good for demonstrating VR. Not everybody wants to be in that situation. Whereas the mountain is much more pleasant. My company, Resolution, we're in Stockholm. We're about 35 people. We have several different teams working on games. This is games that we have released. I'll talk through one of the games that we've worked on for some time as a case example. And that's this game that It's called Bait. We released this in early 2016 after working half a year with it. It was for mobile VR originally. So you take your mobile phone, you put it into a Samsung Gear headset or a Daydream, and you can fish in virtual reality. You hang out different places, and you meet characters, and they give you missions to fish. And this has been fairly successful. We have about 2.5 million downloads, which makes it probably the biggest VR games today. We haven't heard any bigger numbers when it comes to players, at least. We continue working with this title, and we released a social version of it for Facebook's social VR experience that is called Facebook Spaces. So here you can hang out with friends and fish in an icy polar setting, which is really it's a great project for us. We learned a lot, and one of the things that is very cool with this is that you can remove the background and have a live camera here. So it's very, very similar to an AR experience from a developer point of view. And a lot of it is about the social aspects, about hanging out with your friends and talking while you fish. So I've actually been doing interviews with press, fishing, and talking to them at the same time. It's very chilled, fishing is one of those things where you don't need 100% of your mental bandwidth in order to have fun. So you can fish and talk at the same time, unless you catch anything, and it's very hard to keep conversation going. Then after we did that, we are now working on a mobile AR version of this game, and we just announced today that it'll be multiplayer, so you can fish in the same fishing holes with your friends on both Android and iOS devices. We're aiming to soft launch this game soon, and it's quite fun. It works well, and it's really great to have this as an experience on working, trying to make a game where people can use their mobile phones. Because when it comes to VR and head-mounted AR, there's obviously very, very few devices out. Typically a couple of million active at most. Whereas when it comes to AR-enabled phones, there is already hundreds of millions of devices. So it's a larger potential audience, but you need to break through and make a very successful game, which is never easy. And it brings me to the next slide. And that is that the games are extremely hard to make. I've been in about 50 different game productions now. A lot of them have been my concept ideas from the beginning, and I've been with them all the way to the end. And one of the things I learned is that it's incredibly difficult to make games, and that you can never be sure that it's going to be a hit game. Every time you work on a game, you hope that it's going to be a hit game, but you never know. I was so used to this, so when I worked Candy Crush, I was still like, it's going to be hit or miss. I have no clue. And we showed it to some external people at very important companies, and some of them said like, no, this is never going to work. Go home, do it again. This is not unique enough. And it is very, very difficult to make, and you need to hit a lot of the different. There's never one reason why your game became super successful. But the cool thing is that you can be anywhere in the world, and you can be a small team, and you can release something that reaches 500 million players and makes you a ton of money really quickly. So the reward is out there if you make it, but it is very difficult. And one of the things that makes it so difficult is that as a game designer, you have to understand the brain a little bit. And we don't understand the brain as a species yet. There is like this funny catch-22 that if the brain was simple enough so we would understand it, we wouldn't have the brain capacity to understand the brain. And it will continue to be like that for quite some time. I think we're starting to banana flies and the smallest insects, we know approximately how they work. one of the first weeks we started Resolution Game, I drew this Venn diagram on our whiteboard, and I think it's very true today. I think that the largest challenge is still making games. VR and AR is two complex areas, especially if you look at the hardware side. But I am a software developer, so I let other people deal with the difficulties in hardware. But the actual problem of making games is super, super complex, and it never turns out exactly the way you think. So my method there has just been to roll with it and never try to decide what the game is going to be in the end. I decide what the game is going to be like in 2 weeks, and when we're there, we make a new stab at it, and then we continue until we kind of feel that we're finished with it. There's a good book on game design called Fundamentals of Game Design by Ernst Adams, and he says the smallest and most mysterious part of the fun in a game emerges from an unpredictable, unanalyzable, unimaginable quality. Call it luck, magic, stardust. You can't make it happen, so you might as well not worry about it. And I think it's very true. I think it's very important to understand when it comes to visual computing in general, we are still here in the analogy of the mobile phones earlier. We're extremely early, the headsets are clunky, they're not comfortable, they run warm rather early. But there is a lot of interesting things on the horizon now. We are seeing Oculus Go coming out at much lower price point. There is soon going to be something called Santa Cruz from Oculus that is an amazing headset that doesn't have cables, and it runs at a fast rate and has a lot of the components that need to be there to create fantastic experiences. So, to summarize some of the futures of virtual reality that I see is that it has to be cordless in order for it to really fly. Inside-out tracking is something that is coming now very strongly. So it's having cameras in the headset itself looking out instead of cameras looking in. So you don't need to set up a rig in the same way. And this is exactly the same technology they're using for AR. Positional tracking of hands or some type of joystick that knows exactly if you're grabbing something and exactly where in space that hand is super important for it to become more mass market. Foveated rendering is something that is not so far away. I see some of you nodding, most of you not. So the fovea is this area in your eyes where you have enough synapser in Swedish to make it sharp. And you can, if you have eye tracking hardware, you can just render what the fovea is looking at and make that sharp and make everything else blurry around it, which saves, in theory, up to 80% performance, which is great. And this is not that far along. Earlier, we thought as a species that it was going to be about 3 years out, but there is already hardware indicating that this will be coming later this year. So this is great, because this saves performance, battery time, and everything. And open persistent worlds, I predict that this is going to be, once again, much more popular. It had kind of an era of grandness before smartphones came in, but it will come back. It's obviously a lot of people are still using it, but it's going to be more and more important. I also mentioned that I wanted to kind of leeway into our later discussions on voxel and touch a little bit on polygon graphics challenges. So most of you recognize this game, I would imagine. It's different in different countries how popular it is, but this is a screenshot from Minecraft that was developed by a fellow Swede and somebody who Dan here knows since a long time back. There's now a full team behind it, and they were acquired by Microsoft there and still in Sweden. One of the reasons why this became so incredibly popular is that it made it very easy and accessible to create things. You could build your own structures by moving these blocks around in a 3D world. And it became very easy for kids and grown-ups to create things and hang out together and build everything from small houses to large palaces. And this is a trend that will continue to happen for sure, that we'll see more and more user-generated content in games. And one of the things that I find fascinating with creating virtual content is that it is so difficult today to understand how to make good 3D. The tools are incredibly complex, and the people that I work with in my company often have 10 or 15 years of experience being very efficient in these tools and then being able to create things. Whereas a 3-year-old can create a really cool looking character with a piece of pen and paper or clay. And I really think that we need to get there where it's much easier for people to start creating interesting assets, because the last fantastic artist is obviously not born, and I think giving them the tools to create it helps a lot. A lot of the technology that we use today was built during the mid-late 90s and was made to optimize for the type of computers and hardware that was around then. And since then, we've continued in that same track. And yes, they can do a lot of realistic surface rendering with this today, but I think especially looking at creating and destructive things of worlds and characters, then you see how polygon graphics is absolutely not the only option. And one of the things that I feel is very convincing, we have artists internally now who is starting to work with VR and creating their assets in virtual reality. Because if you are in 3D and you have tools that are also in three-dimensional space, it's obviously easier to create 3D assets. Or it will be once those tools are refined enough, because they're still very, very early. This is an example of somebody using Medium that was released about a year ago from Oculus. So it's in a very early iteration of its lifespan, comparing it with Maya or 3D Studio Max or Blender that's been around for years and years. All right, and that's all I had for today. And the idea is that we continue talking about voxels, and you have a presentation about that. And then after that, we'll have kind of an open, more open-ended panel discussion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.